The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. Yeah!
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to go over using dry acid to lower the pH and alkalinity in your pool. I'll go over some of the pros and cons of using dry acid to lower the pH. Leslie's Pool Supplies is a proud partner of the Pool Guy Podcast Show. Leslie's Pool Supplies has been do-it-yourselfers and pool trade professionals' trusted partner since 1963, providing quality products and services to make pool care easy and solutions and expertise to do it right. The industry standard for lowering pH as well as alkalinity in a pool is using 31.45% muriatic acid. If you get your muriatic acid at your hardware store or grocery store, it may not be the 31.45% that we use in the service industry. If you do get it at a local pool store, chances are it is the full 31.45% strength. And so we base a lot of our calculations off of this particular strength of the muriatic acid to lower the pH as well as alkalinity in the pool. And again, this is an industry standard that the muriatic acid has been used ever since I was in the industry to lower the pH. And there are a couple alternatives. I mentioned them in another podcast when I talked about lowering the pH. And this was the Acid Magic, which is a hydrochloric acid. It's also a liquid form. And then you have the dry acid. And the active ingredient is sodium bisulfate, which is a dry granular form of acid that you can add to the pool. You'll see it sold at your local pool store or retailer under pH down or pH reducer. And it may also just be labeled as dry acid. And this is a safe alternative to muriatic acid to use to lower the pH in your pool. It's a more expensive alternative if you do pound by pound or ounce by ounce of the product versus the liquid muriatic acid. You're going to spend more money with the dry acid. However, I found that the dosage of the dry acid kind of equates to making it affordable based on the dosage, not just the equivalent of dry acid to an equivalent of 1 gallon of acid, which if you look online, you're going to see that 1 gallon of muriatic acid at 31.45% is equal to about 10 pounds of the dry acid. However, you don't need 10 pounds of dry acid to have the same effect on the water that you would have with 1 gallon of muriatic acid. I'll kind of go over that and the dosage that I found to be effective in pools, and you'll find that you're going to be using a lot less dry acid to lower the pH in your pool versus the muriatic acid. And so it's not actually a 10-pound equivalent, and I'll definitely go over some of the equivalents that I found in using the dry acid or sodium bisulfate. You can find a lot of articles online regarding using dry acid in your pool. I did come across one article online that has a negative aspect towards using sodium bisulfate in your pool. So I contacted my source over at Taylor Technologies, Wayne Ivy Switch, and I talked to him about the article. I sent him the link to the article. He reviewed it, and then he forwarded it to his friend, Rudy Stankiewicz. These names are hard for me. I'm from New Jersey, so I have trouble with names, and so these are probably two of the toughest names in the industry, and I have to say them back to back. So I contacted Rudy about the article, and I'll reference the article for you so you can actually look it up here. Let me get the reference here. So this is a British water chemistry group, pool water treatment advisory group, PWTAG, and the article you can find it at pwtag.org, and you put the /sulfate-attack-February-2011, and you'll find this article where it details the use of any sulfate-based product in a swimming pool. They also mention aluminum sulfate, which a lot of us use here to flock a pool with, and then of course the dry acid, which is a sodium bisulfate. And so they have different aspects of the article talk about how it could destroy the grout or the surface of a pool using the product, overuse of the product. They also mentioned how it adds to the total dissolved solids in the water. But of course, anything you put in the pool will add to the TDS. And so if you're adding about 10 pounds of the dry acid to your pool, which is a lot of dry acid, that would be 120 parts per million increase in the TDS in the pool. versus the 1 gallon of muriatic acid, which would be 22 parts per million increase. And these numbers are coming from Rudy Stankiewicz, who Wayne forwarded the email to. And so you can see that, of course, you're going to add more TDS because you're putting a dry chemical in the pool, and it's going to add to that. But you have to put a lot of it in there to raise it up. One thing that Rudy also mentioned is that you would have to add a lot of the product to have any of these adverse effects that the article is referring to. So since it's 33% sulfur dioxide, you would need to add a dose of 75 pounds to exceed the maximum of the 300 parts per million recommended. So definitely it's a lot of the product that would cause a problem. So for the casual user of the dry acid sodium bisulfate, I would not worry too much about it. There's also no technical information about it damaging the salt cell plates, so you don't have to worry about that. You wouldn't use the dry acid to clean a saltwater generator. You would use the muriatic acid, or if you wanted to do a lighter acid wash of it, you would use white distilled vinegar on your salt system, the salt cell itself, to clean it. And of course, you wouldn't be using the dry acid because it just wouldn't be an effective way to clean your salt water cell. And so their recommendation is not to use the dry acid in a plaster type gunite pool. Of course, this is one source, and I've read many other articles, none of them citing any kind of danger with using the dry acid as a way to lower the pH. And this article was written back in 2011, so I'm not sure if the article is dated or if the research is still valid today. I just wanted to throw that out to you because if you're researching dry acid on the internet, you're going to run into this article. I found a link to this from, I believe it was Tropical Pool Care. Let me just pull that up too. So I was just Googling it, and it was Tropical Fiberglass Pools that had this article on the dry acid, and they referenced the British study on sodium bisulfate. So I strive to be clear and concise in my evaluation of chemicals, and I don't think I would have done sodium bisulfate justice if I didn't mention this article by this association here to start the podcast off. Now let me jump into the benefits of the dry acid, and I'm also going to go over the dosage that I kind of use and kind of I know that is effective and equates more to a gallon or a quart of acid versus what you would think would be related to a quart of acid. Long story short, 10 pounds of the dry acid is not necessary for 1 gallon of muriatic acid for my testing. So the benefits of the sodium bisulfate dry acid is that it's safe to handle, so it's not going to burn your skin. If you ever had muriatic acid splashed on you, I had the unfortunate incident of having a bad case or bad gallon of acid where the lid was broken, and when I put it back into my truck, it splashed all over me. It was not pleasant, and it definitely does damage to your vehicle. It is a strong oxidizer, so muriatic acid will, of course, rust everything that you store it next to, and I store mine in the backyard, and everything was rusted around the muriatic acid. And of course, the fumes from muriatic acid is also toxic. If you ever got a whiff of it when you're pouring it in, you know that it makes you choke. And so that's another drawback with muriatic acid. And so on the flip side of that, dry acid has no fumes when you're using it, and it won't oxidize and rust everything in your backyard. So it's very easy to store. It's very safe to store. I like the storage aspect of it, and I also like the fact that it's safe to handle. You're not going to drop any, or you're not going to stain your customer's pool deck or driveway with the dry acid. As with the muriatic acid, if you spill some, you're going to definitely stain the customer's driveway or pool deck. So if you have a new pool that you're doing that they spent $200,000 on or $150,000 on, and they have this beautiful coping and deck, you definitely want to use dry acid back there and not muriatic acid in any form. Definitely not. And if you're a homeowner, you wanted to have a safe alternative to muriatic acid, you don't like storing it at your house because of your kids or your pets, you could definitely go with the dry acid. It has a really long shelf life also compared to the muriatic acid. And I mentioned also at the beginning the Acid Magic. It's also a really good alternative. It has a long shelf life also, and it doesn't have the same kind of toxic effects. 90% less fumes than muriatic acid, and it also is safe to use. Just want to throw that in there for another alternative besides the sodium bisulfate dry acid here. And it's very easy to use the sodium bisulfate, very easy to measure. it's a dry chemical, so you measure in ounces. And the best source that I found to calculate your dosage is on the poolcalculator.com site, and they have a category. If you're going to use that site, you would put in the gallons of your pool, and then you would go to the pH and put in what you're at right now. So say it's 8.0 and you want to get to 7.6. And then one other category that's really important is the alkalinity. The alkalinity, as you may know or may not know, the higher the alkalinity, the more of a buffer it is to the acid or to the pH. And so any acid you add to the pool, be it dry acid or muriatic acid, will have less an effect on lowering down the pH because of the higher alkalinity. And if you read the label on most of these products, it'll tell you that an alkalinity above 140 parts per million will require more of the product to lower the pH down. And since this and muriatic acid both lower the pH and alkalinity, the dry acid will also lower down the alkalinity level as you're adding it to lower the pH in your pool. So just keep in mind that the higher your alkalinity, the more of the dry acid you're going to need to have an effect on lowering the pH. And I think this is where a lot of people get the impression that the dry acid is a much more expensive product than the muriatic acid, because if the alkalinity is at 160 or 180, you're going to be adding a lot of the dry acid to the pool to lower down the pH each time you're adding it. However, if the alkalinity is in range of 80 to 120 parts per million, there's no need to add more of the product to the pool than necessary, because the alkalinity is not going to buffer it as much and the pH will drop accordingly to the dosage required based on that calculator, or you can use another online calculator of your choice. I just prefer this one because it's very easy to use, and I've been using this one for years, and I find it to be very accurate. So let me move a little bit into dosage. And so for the pools that I used it on, you don't really need a lot of the product to be effective if the alkalinity is in range. And so in my own personal pool, I'll use that as an example. It's about 14,000 gallons. And so if the pH in my pool was at 8.2 and I wanted to drop it down to 7.6, I would have to add about 20 ounces of the dry acid, and that's with my alkalinity at 100. And if my alkalinity was a little bit higher, I'm going to bring it to 120 here. So if the alkalinity was at 120, the pH was 8.2, and I want to lower it to 7.6, I would need about 30 ounces, or about 1 pound, 14 ounces of the dry acid to lower that down. Let me give you the equivalent of the 31.45% muriatic acid to do the same thing. And so you would need about 23 ounces of the muriatic acid to lower it down from 8.2 to 7.6, which is roughly about a quart of acid to lower it down. So even though you may see that 10 pounds of the sodium bisulfate is equal to 1 gallon of acid, in reality it's not quite because of the alkalinity. The alkalinity is a big factor in the dosage of the sodium bisulfate. For example, if the alkalinity in my pool was at 90, I would only need to use 24 ounces, which is 1 pound, 8 ounces of the dry acid. So you're not actually using straight calculation of 10 pounds for 1 gallon of muriatic acid. In my case, I keep my pools with lower alkalinity. That way I use, of course, less muriatic acid, and I use less dry acid in the pools that I service. And therefore, it's much easier to maintain these pools as far as the pH, lowering it down, and I use less of the product. And I recommend keeping your alkalinity when you're using the dry acid, of course, below 140 parts per million for sure, but keeping it at 100 parts per million is probably the sweet spot for using the dry acid in the pool. That way you're not overusing the product. I found if the alkalinity is within the range of 80 to 120, I'm using about half of a D scoop of the dry acid to lower down the pH in the pool, which is pretty much equivalent to a quart of acid in most pools that I have that I've been using it on. So using half of a D scoop to lower it down in the pool. And if you're a homeowner using a 50-pound bucket of dry acid, that's going to last you quite a long time. If you're just using maybe 20 ounces every week or so, or a pound a week, that technically will last you 50 weeks if you're using about a pound a week in your pool. So cost-wise, I think it's not really that dramatic if you look at it that way. If you're using dry acid on your pool service route, again, it's not a dramatic cost difference if you have the alkalinity in line in your pools and you're not having a lot of pools with 180 or 160 parts per million in the alkalinity aspect of it. and it translates differently because of that aspect. So you can't really go pound for pound versus muriatic acid, and every region is a little bit different. Liquid muriatic acid is more expensive in California and Arizona than it is in Texas. In Florida, it's much cheaper there for the liquid muriatic acid, so it may not be cost effective in those regions where the muriatic acid is cheaper to switch. But in areas like California and Arizona, where the muriatic acid is more expensive, dollar for dollar, it may not be that extreme to go with a 50-pound bucket or 50-pound bag of dry acid. You can buy a 50-pound bag of dry acid here in California for about $65, $70 retail price. And so if you do the math and you're a homeowner that's wanting to switch to dry acid, if you use a quart of acid in your pool a week and you have your pool open all year round, you're using a quart a week in your pool, and these numbers probably aren't realistic because in the winter you're not using that much acid, but let's just say you're using a quart a week, and that would equate to about 3 cases of the muriatic acid, which is 12 gallons of the acid. And if you're paying $20 per case for the 31.45% acid, you're spending $60 a year on acid. And again, a bag or a container of dry acid, a 50-pound bag or bucket, is about $70 retail, maybe $80 in some areas. And so it's not really a huge difference in the dollar factor going from muriatic acid to dry acid. And then you get all the safety benefits built in to the dry acid. The fact that it's safe to handle, safe to store, easy to use. You're going to need some kind of measuring device like a kitchen scale to measure out the ounces. And then you're going to have to use an online calculator on your phone or computer, which you should be using anyway with the muriatic acid so you're not overdosing your pool. And then you're going to keep in mind that the pH range is also factored into the LSI, and so your ideal pH range may not be 7.4 or 7.6 depending on your calcium hardness, your alkalinity, the water temperature, other factors. Borates are actually a factor now in the LSI. These are all things that you have to kind of keep in mind when you're trying to get your pH down. So ideally you may not be wanting to get it down to 7.4. You may be wasting money trying to get it that low. So the LSI is also something you need to factor in. I think one of the best LSI calculators is from Orenda Technologies. If you go over to my website, swimmingpoollearning.com, if you scroll down to the middle of the homepage, you're going to see the pool calculator app link, and right next to it will be the Orenda calculator for the LSI. And so you want to plug those numbers in so you know you're not overdosing your pool with either muriatic acid or the dry acid product. So I don't think you can say that the dry acid product is a much more expensive product than muriatic acid. In some areas, it may just be a wash. Other areas, of course, it'll be more for the dry acid. I think if you factor in the safety benefits of using the dry acid in your pool, also the shelf life, the easy storage, it's not going to rust everything, the fact that it's no toxic fumes, and the safe to use around kids and pets, these are all important factors that if you put that into the price point of it, it really makes sense that you're paying a little extra for it, of course, but as the price of muriatic acid keeps increasing across the region, I think it's going to be a wash pretty soon as far as the price point. And I wouldn't say you should base all of your pool purchases on price point anyway. If you look at it that way, you're going to be getting the really cheap acid at Home Depot or Walmart that's really ineffective, and it's not really going to be cost effective in the long run with the weaker acid. So I think considering the dry acid, definitely I referenced that article at the beginning that you should read. It's only one source that I found that has any kind of negative connotation, so using dry acid, but since it exists out there, you should be aware of it. But everything else you're going to reference out there has the great benefits of using the dry acid in your pool versus any negative connotations of that. And I wouldn't let any kind of price point be a discouragement in using the dry acid product. Again, you shouldn't be basing your pool purchases on price point only, but on, of course, ease of use and safety would be big factors. I think if you have little children, switching to dry acid would be something that you should do without even thinking about it. If you have pets around your pool, putting in muriatic acid will make your dogs kind of sneeze and gag, just like if it was a human. So definitely the safety aspect. And again, I mentioned if you have an expensive pool coping and deck, you don't want acid drops all over it. So the dry acid would be a logical switch for you for sure. If you do pool service, you may want to do the math on it to see if switching from dry acid from muriatic acid is logical. I like the product because it's easy to use and it's safe, and I don't have any problems with it. I think you have to use, again, a pretty large amount of it in the pool to have any kind of negative effects, according to the article that I referenced. And so switching over to it may make economic sense for your pool business. Of course, if you use a van for pool service, you definitely want to use dry chemicals anyway. So it's definitely something to investigate and look into as a safe alternative to using muriatic acid for your pool service and, of course, for your personal use in your pool. Again, if you go back to my website, swimmingpoollearning.com, you're going to scroll over to chemicals and you'll scroll down and you're going to see the dry acid write-up that I have there and also the video that I filmed on using the product. And if you're in the industry and you're looking for more help with your business or you want to enhance your business, definitely check out my coaching program at poolguycoaching.com. A lot of great benefits from joining the group, including the ability to text me and call me in real time, plus other discounts. You can learn more about it at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. Leslie's Pool Supplies has been do-it-yourselfers and pool trade professionals' trusted partner since 1963, providing quality products and services to make pool care easy and solutions and expertise to do it right.